I'm Matt Davenport.
And this is Carrie Jansen.
It's a very special day here at Stereochemistry.
C&EN reporter Tian Nguyen has brought us a story, and it's kind of, well, would you say controversial?
I think controversial is probably about right. The story is about ChemArchive. A lot of our listeners may already know of it, and judging from Twitter, they have opinions about it. ChemArchive is a preprint server designed specifically for chemists to publish their work for anyone to see. This lets them share their data, methods, and conclusions before any of those things find a home in a more traditional peer-reviewed journal. ChemArchive's beta site was launched in August by the American Chemical Society. Around the same time, another preprint server, C&EN, came online. C&EN is run by Elsevier's Social Science Research Network. But today, we're focusing on ChemArchive because I've been following a group that's gone through the entire process, from ChemArchive to peer-reviewed journal.
And you should know that the American Chemical Society publishes C&EN, which of course makes this podcast. ACS also publishes a suite of traditional scientific journals and runs ChemArchive, which was developed with guidance from the Royal Society of Chemistry, the German Chemical Society, and the Chinese Chemical Society.
Although ChemArchive is new, preprint servers have been around for years. There's Archive, probably the best-known preprint server, used mainly by physicists, that went online in the early 90s. Then came bioRxiv for biologists a few years ago. Now chemists have ChemArchive. ChemArchive already has vocal supporters and detractors. That's because it's raised all sorts of tough questions about what having a platform that bypasses peer review will do to chemistry. Will it undermine conventional publishing? How should news organizations cover chemistry that's not been peer reviewed? How should people treat the chemistry that's published there? And what does it mean in terms of establishing priority? Like, if you publish to ChemArchive first, will that get you recognition for being the inventor, or just make you more likely to get scooped? We'll wade into the deep end with those big picture questions soon enough. For now, let's start the conversation somewhere familiar, with chemistry, and of course, with chemists.
My name is Ryan Shempy. I'm an associate professor of chemistry at the Scripps Research Institute.
My name is Jeremy Roach, and I'm a fifth-year grad student in Ryan's lab.
Ryan, Jeremy, and their co-authors posted one of the first preprints to appear on ChemArchive. I actually covered it for C&EN, but even before that, in just a few days after publishing to the server, Ryan and Jeremy's manuscript had thousands of views. 6 months later, that number has grown to close to 10,000 views, which Ryan says makes it probably one of the most read papers from his lab. That's a lot of traffic for a study that they essentially posted on a whim.
Yeah, in retrospect, it was maybe a little too spontaneous. I'd love to portray it as this calculated and shrewd decision, but it's simply not the case. About 2 weeks before we posted the paper, I had presented the same work at a Gordon Research Conference. Sort of to beta test the ideas because I didn't know how they'd be received. And honestly, I was worried that the work might be misunderstood. I could be run out on a rail for betraying the total synthesis community. Actually, to my surprise, this conceptual framework that I presented was pretty well received. So that was great, but then I had the opposite problem. I thought maybe I had just torpedoed our intellectual property on multiple fronts by this presentation. Sort of sat and stewed on that for a couple weeks. And then I ended up chatting with my colleague Donna Blackman, and she has been heavily involved in the ChemArchive setup and analysis. So she mentioned that it had just gone up the day before, and I had just had my morning coffee, so everything sounded like a great idea. I rushed upstairs, talked it over with Jeremy, quickly emailed our collaborator Laura Bond, and we posted the paper a couple hours later.
For Jeremy, this was his first publication on his graduate work. I asked if he was nervous about putting it on this brand new preprint server.
Yeah, a little bit. Ryan was very gung-ho about it, and I was a little bit more skeptical when he brought the idea to me. But I think ultimately the point is to disseminate your work and inform the field of what you're doing and what your ideas are, and the potential pitfalls of it, I thought, were not so bad. It was worth getting around all the troubles that we were having through the review process and getting the work out there.
Ryan explained that the trouble with the peer review process for this paper stems from the fact that their paper is a departure from the norm. The paper falls in the field of natural product total synthesis. It's a field known for making these monstrously complex molecules that have valuable and documented medicinal properties like anti-cancer or antibacterial activity. And Ryan's lab, well, took a different approach.
What's sacrosanct in natural product total synthesis is the structure. The whole point is to get to this structure, solve problems along the way, and end up making exactly what's been made by cellular processes. Of course, we're not doing that, and we're not even attempting to do that. The natural product itself is a fundamentally flawed molecule. What we're doing is we're changing the target structure.
What they proposed to do was make a molecule related to the natural product, a natural product called salvinorin A. The molecule happens to be the most potent hallucinogen ever discovered. But more importantly, salvinorin A binds selectively to receptors in the brain called kappa opioid receptors. Kappa is a cousin of the mu opioid receptor that most opioid drugs target. Researchers have found evidence that drugs binding to kappa could provide pain relief without the accompanying feelings of euphoria that lead to opioid addiction. Ryan and Jeremy reasoned that deleting one particular methyl group nestled in the center of salvinorin A would make the structure more stable and much easier to make. So they decided to make that molecule instead. According to their calculations, this modified structure should still have salvinorin A's potent binding abilities. But they couldn't and wouldn't know for sure for almost 4 years.
So this was a long journey, and this has been a real labor of love. Jeremy has worked on this pretty much his entire PhD, and it was incredibly risky endeavor because we were making a compound for biological purposes, although the compound was not known to have any biological activity. So it was a huge risk, and I have only great things to say for Jeremy's fortitude, persistence, courage, and a little foolishness for undertaking and completing this project.
I think second year grad student Jeremy, when he made the decision to take this project, didn't know how naive he was being.
Luckily for fifth year Jeremy, his naivete paid off. The salvinorin analog showed selective binding to the kappa opioid receptor, and the 10-step synthesis they came up with gave them a way to make other related compounds as well. They wrote up these findings, which ultimately made their debut in ChemArchive. Here's where things got interesting. A few weeks after they posted their manuscript on ChemArchive, another paper related to salvinorin A came out in Organic Letters, an ACS journal. At this point, Ryan and Jeremy's paper was still under review at a conventional journal, which I won't name. The Orglet paper was from Thomas Provenzano's group at the University of Kansas. The Kansas researchers also simplified the structure of salvinorin A, although they did so by using different chemistry and modifying more of the molecule. Still, they did delete the same pesky methyl group as Ryan and Jeremy. The Provenzano group did not get back to our request for an interview before we recorded this podcast. At any rate, the Orglet paper doesn't cite Ryan and Jeremy's ChemArchive preprint. I asked Ryan if he thought they should have cited his paper, and he says it's not for him to say. Citations are just one of many new and confusing issues that preprints present for researchers. When I reached out to Ryan and Jeremy for an interview to write up their preprint in C&EN in September, they actually declined to speak with me. Ryan said he was dying to talk about the work, but he didn't think that he could without jeopardizing his students' chances of landing a high-profile publication. Now, every journal has their own policy for dealing with preprints. Some journals like JACS and Angewandte don't deal with them at all, having decided not to accept any manuscripts that have appeared on ChemArchive. Other journals do take preprints, but subject to certain stipulations that can be confusing to researchers. Science is one such journal. We invited our neighbor Jake Yeston, Science's chemistry editor, into our studio to help dispel some of that confusion.
So, what we actually tell authors is not to seek out press coverage.
Jake is part of the team at Science responsible for getting manuscripts peer-reviewed and ready for publication, so although he's not setting Science's preprint policy, he's familiar with it. Jake understands that sometimes the press, such as myself, seek out scientists, which can lead to some sticky situations.
I would say the really complicated nexus is between not journals and archives alone, but journals, archives, and the news media. When you write a story about a paper on archive, and the comments that you get when you write your story are, "This is great," it doesn't matter all that much what the author says to you. The real problem comes when you're writing a story and the paper's on archive and it gets severely critiqued. And then I think we are really disadvantaging the authors by saying to them, well, you're not allowed to defend your work.
And that disadvantage isn't unique to preprint servers. For example, Jake says this has happened before with work presented at conferences. I asked him what he would say to researchers who found themselves in this tough position where their work was on an archive, being debated in the press, but not yet published in Science, and they wanted to respond.
Honestly, at this point, it's hard for me to envision a scenario where we would proactively reject a paper because journalists decided of their own accord to cover it on a preprint server, and the author commented in that context. I think we understand that telling people they're allowed to post papers on arXiv presupposes that these situations are going to arise. If we never wanted this to happen, we would have to tell people not to put their papers there.
But he can envision some scenarios where the mixing of preprints, journals, and journalists could create problems for chemists.
The other challenge of a journalist covering a paper on arXiv is that there's still a lot of confusion over what constitutes priority. And by priority, I mean who got there first. You can imagine two different research groups. One of the research groups is a little sloppy, and they rush to finish their paper so that they can get it up on arXiv so that C&E News can write a piece. The other group is meticulous. They do all of their control experiments. They scale up all their reactions instead of just characterizing them. They try to look at the broader implications, maybe study the mechanism. Then they send the work to a journal, they get it reviewed, right? So it's possible that in that circumstance, if those two papers were sent to the journals at the same time, the more meticulous paper would probably end up getting published sooner because the sloppier paper would have to get revised extensively. But if you cover the sloppy paper when it's on the arXiv, and you don't write a very long article that says, well, this is okay because it's first past the post, but, there's a lot of things that they could have done better. There's a lot of things that they could have paid a little more attention to. Then, in some sense, you've privileged people for being first at the expense of being careful.
Jake wraps up by saying, is it really journalism's problem? He's not sure. But since we're journalists, we'll talk a little bit about how we handle covering ChemArchive. But before we get there, Jake says he still sees some fundamental, unresolved questions lingering around ChemArchive. For example, what is the financial incentive for running a free preprint server in the land of paid subscription journals? Like, will people see that a new science paper has come out online and say, oh, I'll just go read it for free on ChemArchive? He also points to the ever-growing number of journals and wonders how many more we actually need.
Do we need more than Jackson Angewandte? Do we also need chemical science and chem?
As he's going through this list of journals,
then you have, again, you have, I think, organometallics, right?
So let me ask, do we need ChemArchive?
The answer to that question is really not clear to me yet.
After the break, us media types will finally weigh in on ChemArchive, and we'll hear from someone at the ChemArchive mothership, but not before diving into the civilized slugfest that was the ChemArchive session at the ACS meeting in DC this past fall.
Hey everyone, it's Doria from C&EN, and we need your help assembling this year's Talented 12 presented by Thermo Fisher Scientific. The T12 is a group of a dozen up-and-coming scientists that the chemistry community needs to know about. C&EN will feature those chemists in a cover story later this year. We enlisted Alex Spicojny of UCLA to help us make our appeal, not just because he's a T12 alum, but he's also used ChemArchive. Small world, right? Some of Alex's upper-level undergraduates published work from a lab class to the preprint server. Here's Alex on the thinking that made that possible.
We decided that we're going to try to essentially change the classes from an old school way how they're taught. The students go in the lab, they have developed protocols for them where they sort of learn a technique and some sort of methodology and kind of repeat something that has been done already.
Alex and his TAs developed a 10-week program in which groups of undergrads developed new catalysts for aminations. The students then learned how to write up the work for a manuscript instead of just a lab notebook, and the group published it to ChemArchive. That work also just appeared in the journal Dalton Transactions, but Alex is happy with his decision to go with ChemArchive first.
Many of the students graduated and they, for example, don't have access to academic literature anymore. And they want to share it with their friends and families. So the fact that, these ChemArchive submissions are publicly available, right? Anybody can click on it and access the manuscript and the data. I think it's a great thing. And I think undergraduates appreciated the fact that you can come up after, a relatively short research stint in a lab like this with something that can potentially affect how other researchers think about science.
And Alex has actually changed how he thinks about science since he was named one of C&EN's Talented 12 in 2016.
One of the cool things is that I was just able to meet people and researchers in so many different fields that I might not have met if I wasn't part of the Talented 12. We've met with Karina Chapman, who's a very talented, both literally and because she's part of the Talented 12, spectroscopist, beamline scientist at Argonne. We also started collaborating recently with a few other folks in the T12. Renee Frontier, she's at Minnesota, and also Fikil Bruchat, he's at MIT. So I think that just the overall experience of being able to network with some phenomenal scientists, it's been absolutely priceless.
Alex and Karina actually just published a paper together in Nature Materials. And now you can help us put together the next chemistry dream team by visiting talented12.cenmag.org and clicking on Nominate Candidates for 2018. We're looking for the best and brightest early career chemists from all over the world working in academia, government, and industry. The deadline for nominations is April 8th at 11 p.m. Eastern.
Before the break, we were talking to Jake Yessen of Science, who thought that the most interesting new wrinkles introduced by ChemArchive would be those involving scientists, journals, and journalists. And those three groups were all present last fall in Washington, D.C. at a symposium about ChemArchive at the ACS National Meeting. Lauren Wolf, the leader of C&EN's science and technology team, was there, so we asked her to fill us in.
I think the big ticket session was the one where they had some ACS journal editors talking about ChemArchive, because there is some controversy. I don't know what precisely the number is now, but back at that time, only about 80% of the ACS journals were accepting preprint papers. Notable among those is that JACS, the flagship journal of the ACS, still does not accept papers that have been preprints. And so there was a JACS editor there, Chad Merkin, and also an editor from ACS Nano, Paul Weiss, was there. Now, ACS Nano does accept preprint papers, but they had made a pretty formal statement that if they were going to accept a preprint paper, that it had to have more novelty than the average paper. And so there was some backlash about that online. And so up until this meeting, people were looking forward to hearing what these editors, some pro ChemArchive, some con ChemArchive, were going to say.
Here are some of the pros she heard in the room and on Twitter. Preprint data can be used in grant applications. Preprints benefit younger researchers who are under more pressure to quickly establish themselves. Preprints are free to access, meaning more people around the world can read them. And preprints let you put a stake in the ground. Now on the flip side, the cons. Some people thought that once you post a preprint, your work is no longer novel, and journals want to publish novel work. Another concern was that posting a preprint might lead to you getting scooped. Think back to Jake's example where Group A is less thorough, but publishes to ChemArchive quicker. But now imagine that another group working on something similar sees that preprint and decides, we've got to publish, now. So to some people, preprints are a stake in the ground, but a stake that gives away your position, letting others try to rush past you to publication in a journal. So I've been thinking about these concerns while working on this podcast for a few months now. It seems that there's one main question at the heart of the uncertainty around preprints. And that is, when scientists discover something new, who should get to break the news first? Should the scientists get to do so before peer review? Or should it be the journals or journalists who can vet the work with outside reviewers? Honestly, I don't think anybody involved with this podcast, myself included, can answer that, and certainly not in an unbiased way. I don't think any one person can. But what I can tell you about is how C&EN decided to approach covering the papers on ChemArchive. Writing about Ryan and his gang's preprint last fall took me into uncharted territory. At that point, I had never written about scientific work that had not been peer-reviewed and gotten that gold star of academic approval. So I turned to my editor, Lauren, with my questions. What was our policy for covering preprints?
My thought was, I'm kind of making this up as I go. It's not that we've never covered preprint papers before. It just hasn't been a frequent occurrence. There are other preprint servers that have been out there for physics and bio and engineering and other things. But we chemists haven't had one thus far. And so this was sort of the first time where I had to sit down and think, okay, well, what should our policy be about this? And what should our aims be? How do we make a decision about whether we're going to cover a paper like this? And so, yeah, it's uncharted territory.
What Lauren told me was that first, we needed to know if Ryan would even talk to us. And as we quickly found out, the answer was no. So I went back to Lauren.
My thought was, well, there has to be some way where we can still write about this paper, because if we don't, it's in the public. People are tweeting about it. People are blogging about it. We need to be part of this conversation. And so how can we get around this? Which was why we sort of settled on the strategy that we did, which was, if he can't tell us about the science, then let's talk to a whole bunch of experts in the field who can help make sure we understand how they did the science in the paper.
I ended up contacting about 8 organic chemistry professors, 4 of whom responded with comments, all of which were pretty positive. I also fielded questions like, how did you get the paper prior to peer review? And what journal is it going to appear in? To which I explained our thought process and basically said, we're all on new ground here. In the meantime, we discovered that certain journals do at least allow researchers to fact-check any news stories written about their work. We told Ryan, and he fact-checked the scientific accuracy of our piece, and we included a line in our story that says, quote, "The authors declined to discuss the work with C&EN for this story except to confirm its factual accuracy." The story, titled Synthetic Simplification of Hallucinogen Pays Off, came out a little over 2 weeks from when the manuscript first appeared on ChemArchive. That's a longer turnaround than usual. Typically, we'll cover a paper on the day it comes out if we know about it beforehand, or at least within a few days of its online release. Looking back on the whole experience, I asked Lauren if there was any part of the process that she'd do differently.
I don't think so. I think you handled it really well. I think the lessons learned are that if we're going to cover a preprint server paper, it's going to take more time and more effort, but that potentially the payoff is a really big one because we've got a story that not everyone else has.
Wired did cover Ryan and Jeremy's work, but a few months after we did.
I think the interesting thing about these preprint servers actually comes for news outlets. If a journal doesn't want you to write about something, they have a lot of ways of making that happen, as we've discussed, right? Not letting researchers talk to us. Could a story be 1,000 times better if the researcher gave us the backstory of how they made the discovery? Yes, and that would be a better news story every time. But we're sort of, in the meantime, working within this construct of being restricted. It's the game we play. It is the construct that's in place.
Preprints on the whole, however, are not new to scientists or journalists. Matt reached out to some other science writers to see how they cover preprints, such as those on arXiv or bioRxiv.
Yeah, and I honestly was not that surprised to find out how you covered Ryan and Jeremy's work is basically how other folks are covering preprints. Once science is out in the public, whether it's in a journal or on a preprint server or talked about openly at a conference, it's fair game for coverage. But in cases where the work is not peer-reviewed, reporters tend to be more cautious and or rigorous by sending the work to more experts for comment, for example. What did surprise me, though, was hearing how other reporters feel about preprints.
I love covering preprints. They often spark real-time, lively discussions among scientists on social media and elsewhere. So I get to peek in at these conversations about science that are usually happening out of sight during the peer review process.
That was Erica Check-Hayden, who covered biomedical research for Nature for 15 years before becoming the director of the science communication program at UC Santa Cruz. She was one of my instructors when I went there. We also heard from Emily Conover, who covers physics for Science News. She said that arXiv is one of her several go-to spots when she's looking for new papers to cover. So I'm really curious to see if we start feeling the same way about chemistry preprint servers in the future.
Okay, let's take stock of who we've talked to about ChemArchive. We've got scientists, someone who works for a chemistry journal, and someone who works for a chemistry magazine. Who are we missing?
So I'm Marshall Brennan. I am the publishing manager for ChemArchive.
Marshall is a former Nature chemistry editor and joined ChemArchive in September. He spent a lot of time talking to chemists about the role of ChemArchive. I asked him, how does he view ChemArchive's role in the publishing landscape?
So in terms of where it fits into the hierarchy of things, is that it should be somewhere between a conference either paper, publication, poster, and your final journal article. When you're making the decision about whether or not to preprint something, it's ultimately should be the same thought process that you take when you decide, should this student talk about this project at conference? Why? Because most conferences don't have a NDA that you sign, so it is public disclosure in a lot of cases, but it's public disclosure on a smaller scale.
Basically, if you're really worried about getting scooped by the competition, you would probably be more careful about what you present at a conference they're attending. That same thinking applies to preprints. I also asked Marshall about the elephant in the room, or building rather. He works one floor above us here at the American Chemical Society headquarters in DC, and ACS publishes some of the journals that don't accept preprints. So if ACS is supporting ChemArchive, can't Marshall and his team just tell the journals to fall in?
So this is obviously a very complicated issue that people can read into any way they like. And what I think is most telling about how this has gone over is that when the press release came out in 2016 saying that ChemArchive was going to be a thing, about, I think it was less than half of all of the ACS journals would consider a submission that had gone to a preprint server. Now it's really just down to a handful of journals. Primarily it's JACS, it's Organic Letters, it's one of the journals in our toxicology portfolio, and the other sort of high-profile journal that currently doesn't take preprints is Angewandte Chemie. We respect our community, and our community is involved in our journals via the editorial boards, and so we respect our editors to make decisions about content because they are proxies for our community. It has been said that ACS is in JACS's title. Why don't you just tell them to take preprints, right? Well, that kind of goes against our mission of respecting authors, respecting chemists by respecting the decisions that their editors make. So yes, I personally, and I think a lot of people involved with ChemArchive would love if JACS would change their policy, but ultimately we respect that that's not our decision to make because of how we structure those journals. It's a new thing and not everybody understands, and there's this sort of elephant in the corner of, hey, JACS might not accept your paper. You know, it's something we need to talk about, right? Because that's a very real thing, but we're not out to say everyone needs to preprint everything, and we're not here to destroy journals. We really like journals.
Peter Stang, editor-in-chief of JACS, has said that their editorial board will revisit their policy on preprints at the fall 2018 ACS National Meeting. If anything changes, we'll be sure to let you know. Since ChemArchive's start, about 220 preprints have appeared on its site. For comparison, bioRxiv had about 340 preprints in the same length of time after they launched. Highly recognizable groups have been preprinting their work, and others have used the server in unique ways, such as UCLA's Alex Spokojny. And Ryan Shenvi, who we began our story with, has since posted another paper, a follow-up to their first one on ChemArchive. We caught up with him just as he was getting ready to post the second preprint to talk about why he was going back.
Oh, I just like ChemArchive. I don't know. because it's so satisfying to finish your work and just put it out there. I mean, because, I don't know, maybe it's the little kid in me, but I just wanted, my kids always come up to me and they want, hey, look at this. Hey, Daddy, look at this. Look what I did. And they want some feedback. I don't know. I haven't done enough internal psychoanalysis. I just like to finish something and get it out.
Cool. So have you gotten much feedback from the community then?
I have not. I'm so not from the people within my community.
He says most of the feedback he receives is typically through giving seminars in other departments. He had hopes to get more feedback by putting the paper on ChemArchive. He's heard from people on Twitter, but says he didn't get any in-depth comments. I asked Marshall if ChemArchive had a commenting system, and he said they did at first, but they had such a huge problem with spam that they were forced to shut it down. They're working on bringing it back, though he wasn't at liberty to say when it'll be back or exactly how it'll work. But it's also unclear if once it's online, people will actually use it. Jake says Science and Nature, which publish a lot more than just chemistry, have commenting systems that people rarely use.
I mean, Science and Nature have both had open commenting systems for about 2 or 3 years.
Oh, they
right?
do?
Yeah. And nobody ever uses them. Literally. You could go up to one of Phil Barron's papers published in Science Now, and you could say, this is great. I love it. Or you could say, how come you take so many papers from Phil? Whatever you want to say, you could go up there and you can say it. And it's very lightly moderated, as long as you use polite language and don't link to your website selling purse knockoffs.
No one comments on synthesis papers? You've never
no one
seen
comments
one?
on anything. It's prohibitively rare for us to, once in a while, if a paper is clearly going south, then we'll get some comments. Mm-hmm. But it's prohibitively rare for people to use that commenting system. When we set this up, we had hours of meetings about how we were going to moderate it. Oh, I'm serious. We came up with countless hypotheticals of the notional kind of comment that we would really struggle to figure out whether to allow somebody to post or not. And we had, our legal advisor come and talk about it, and then nothing happened.
Because we're dedicated reporters, Matt Davenport and I went onto Science's website and left a comment, or what they call an e-letter, on a Phil Barron paper in an attempt to realize Jake's hypothetical scenario.
Oh, here it is. E-letters. Submit a response to this article.
Oh, hey, there you go. So a text box just opened up.
Okay. Compose e-letter. This is a test for C&EN, the news magazine of the American Chemical Society.
Just say that Jake said that we could do this.
Jake Yeston said that we could do this.
Well, I'm also curious if the author gets pinged that someone commented on their article. And if that's the case, we should, say shout out to Phil.
P.S. Shout out to Phil.
And about a week later, it appeared. So ChemArchive hasn't been the crowdsourced peer-reviewing destination that optimists hope for. But neither has it been the self-scooping, novelty-killing platform some feared. But maybe this is what we should have expected all along. Preprints may be new to us chemists, but they're not new, and physicists and biologists seem to have made it work. So what is the reality of ChemArchive as we understand it right now? Jake of Science says that the preprint server isn't a bad idea, and that he's curious to see how many people use it and where it goes from here. Marshall at ChemArchive is excited to keep improving the server through community feedback. He and his team are also looking for ways to add revenue, like offering a service that transfers preprint papers to journals. Journals would pay for this service, which there is precedent for. The idea is actually from bioRxiv. Lauren at C&EN says she thinks ChemArchive is here to stay, but that it'll take a culture change, which may come with some growing pains. And we at C&EN will be reporting all along the way. Ryan at Scripps says his main hope for ChemArchive is that it will develop into a way to crowdsource peer review. He also has an interesting take that because ChemArchive muddles the meaning of what constitutes priority, it might actually lessen the focus on being first. Overall, he says he's glad he decided to post his group's Salvinorin A paper on ChemArchive.
It was really gratifying, actually. It was a real sense of empowerment. Anybody that does scientific research knows the excitement of sharing your work with the world, and especially work that you're really proud of. And then all of a sudden, when the work is done, you're limited by the publication process. You've got capricious referees, there are slow turnaround times. It takes the timeline completely out of your own hands. ChemArchive is empowering because throughout the whole discovery process, you move at your own pace, right? You're limited only by the speed at which you can solve problems. A preprint server, despite all the possible problems that could arise, at least returns freedom of movement and speed to the researcher.
That Salvinorin A paper is now published in an open access ACS journal, ACS Central Science. All right, folks, that's our episode. If you liked this episode, or if you didn't like it, though that'd be surprising that you made it this far, subscribe to Stereochemistry. We'll be coming out with stories monthly. Until then, you can connect with us on social media. Find me on Twitter at MustLoveScience.
I'm at Absolute Carrie. That's Kerri.
And I'm at Mr. Matt Davenport. If you'll be at the ACS National Meeting in New Orleans, please come find us. We will all be there.
The music you heard in this podcast is by Lee Rosevere. You can find links to the tracks in the description. Thanks for listening.